Welcome to today's edition of the IP Speaker Series. Today's webinar is on open source software. My name is Bradley, and I am the Education Program Manager at New Ventures BC. We're joined by your host today, Byron Thom, and our guest, Maya Medeiros from Norton. Before we begin, I do want to acknowledge that New Ventures BC is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We're privileged to work and play on these lands. In addition to this, we have some housekeeping notes just before we get started. So please ensure you're on mute unless called upon. If you have any questions, I invite you to please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Really helps us to stay organized and get all your questions answered. Additionally, if you feel comfortable doing so, I also invite you to turn your camera on. Helps us feel more engaged with our audience. It's always good to see who's coming to these events as well. If you're interested in continuing your education in IP, I invite you to check out our IP Pathways program. So this program is delivered on a flexible model and is here to help you accelerate your journey in IP. I'll send a link in the chat once I'm done speaking with some more information as well. And with that, I'll introduce you to your host, Byron Thom. So Byron is an engineer and a lawyer. He's practiced at one of the leading IP boutiques in Canada, helping startups and multinationals protect their technological assets. He's a startup founder, a venture capitalist, and board member. He's also an inventor who has drafted and prosecuted his company's own patent applications. He now works with companies to develop IP strategies and focus their resources on key assets that matter to the business, the investors, and potential acquirers. Welcome, Byron.
Great. Thank you, Bradley, and for that introduction as well. Welcome, everyone. We're excited to have Maya Medeiros here with us today talking about open source software. Maybe just first, before we begin the session, to do a few acknowledgements of my own. So thanks to New Ventures BC and Accelerate IP for hosting us today. As Bradley mentioned, my name is Byron Thom. I am a partner at BDC Capital at the Industrial Innovation Venture Fund. This is a fund investing in Canadian startups across Canada, managing about $450 million in Series A, Series B investments into technology companies focused on industrial innovation. So this includes anything that you can kind of fit into those words, but often we talk about three main pillars. One is advanced manufacturing, so robotics, analytics, and AI in the industrial space, in the manufacturing space, excuse me. Two is ag and food technologies, and three is technologies in the extractive space. So this is mining, oil and gas. Out west, I always say forestry and oceans. And so actively looking for technology companies that often rely on IP. As mentioned, I am what I call a reformed lawyer, although still licensed and worked in this space for a number of years prior to moving my way over to entrepreneurship. And so have been working with technology companies talking about IP for many, many years. I know Bradley already did his ALAND acknowledgement, but I just also reiterate that we have many people joining us from across BC and across Canada. Maya herself, I think, is near the Kootenays, right? And so we just want to honor and respect the traditional caretakers from wherever you may be joining us from today. So today's topic is on open source software, and we have a really great speaker to engage in kind of a fun conversation. I'll let Maya do her own introduction, but suffice to say that I've known Maya for a number of years, over a decade now, and have had the pleasure of working with her at one point in time. And she is an expert in both IP and in copyrights and open source software. And so we're really lucky to have her join this conversation today. So Maya, maybe I'll hand it over to you for a brief introduction before we get going on the conversation.
Thank you, Byron, and thanks everybody for joining us today. This is a topic that I actually find very interesting, and I've been passionate about since going to law school, starting law school in 2003. And Byron, it's been great knowing you over the years as well. I'm an IP lawyer at Norton Fulbright, and I'm a partner in their Vancouver office, but I also work a lot with our Toronto office, so I sort of have a hybrid practice in that regard. I also have a background in computer science and math. Before going to law school, I went to University of Toronto and had the opportunity to work with a hardware startup at that time as well. So I do come from sort of that startup background. And maybe we can just jump right in to open source.
Perfect. And so this is a topic I know that most startups have dealt with, whether they know about it or not, because open source software is prevalent throughout the internet and throughout lots of different types of technology. Really, we're focused on software open source aspects, but it does apply to a number of other things. And so maybe we'll just get right into it and just start off with a high-level discussion about what is open source software and why do we care?
Well, I think open source software generally refers to software that is released royalty-free or at no cost, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're free to use the software and do whatever you want with the code. And sometimes that is a common misconception. Software code is generally protected by copyright. And so any use by third parties requires the permission or a license from the owners of that copyright in the code. And functionality of the code may also be protected by patents. And so if use of that patented invention also requires permission by the patent owner. So there is a license or permission required to use. And so the code is generally released through what's referred to as an open source license that allows users to freely use and modify and distribute the software and its source code. So that means anybody can inspect or look at the source code and be free to change, which fosters a really collaborative, open, transparent development environment. However, these licenses also set out obligations or conditions on that use. And so you must comply with that, or those conditions, or else discontinue using the code because then you no longer have that permission, the copyright license or the patent license to use that code.
Yeah, great. And so we talk about why we're using it. Is there kind of maybe a more definite kind of definition that we can refer to? Does it just refer to anything that has attached this type of contract?
Yeah, exactly. There's no legal definition of open source, and there's no single license that all open source code is released under. But generally, you don't negotiate the terms of the open source license, kind of like terms of use for a website. It's like, here's the code, use it for free, but you have to accept this license. You don't have to sign it off or you negotiate parts of it generally. So it's like the standard license that's posted on the internet. But there are all of these different types of open source licenses. So compliance can be quite tricky. Sometimes it's even hard to figure out which one applies. Usually they have it embedded within the code itself in a file or a header, but sometimes it can be tricky to find that. And to further complicate matters, there could be a single software tool that has a lot of different functionality. It could actually be a package of many different open source files. And each of those files may actually be associated with a different license. And I refer to the Linux operating system as an example. There is actually a bundle of different licenses. So that makes compliance a bit more tricky. So there is no legal definition, but these are generally, what you see out there.
Got it. Okay, well, it sounds complicated. And so why bother, I guess, for startups or for developers? Why are they using open source software that is kind of bound by these contracts that they may or may not understand and may have different flavors of?
Well, some open source tools have been around for decades. And so there could be a time and resource savings to using these tools that have already been thoroughly tested and vetted. And sometimes open source tools are sort of the industry standard for certain types of functionality. And so you're kind of going to a best in class for using a best in class tool for free. So that's great for this cost savings as well, because you're getting it for free, but you're also getting some great tool that you don't have to develop from scratch yourself internally.
Yeah. And I think the other aspect that I know lots of companies rely on is the security aspect and the community aspect where, right, if they've been around for decades in some situations, and the source code has been available for that long, there's been a sense that that community aspect of looking at it, updating it, and through the process of continuing to build out open source, that may be more secure, may leverage capabilities and resources that startups or other types of companies don't necessarily want to spend on pieces of software that are not necessarily core to their business.
Precisely. And you can get like a temperature, for example, or an alert system or a timer, things like this that may not be, completely novel from a functional perspective, but great to have sort of a well-tested solution for that readily available.
Can you maybe list some of the most common types? Like you mentioned Linux already, but where are other places where companies may be encountering or wanting to compare an open source library versus something that they may want to buy or license through traditional means?
A browser, a web browser, for example. You might see like a Firefox browser, for example, or a Chrome browser available where you might have to, there's also commercial browsers as options as well. So that's another example. Text
Right.
editing as well. As I mentioned, things about monitoring, third-party monitoring tools like IoT devices, that sort of thing, just standalone applications that may not be particularly complex, but a nice, elegant solution available that's well vetted and tested.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so maybe flipping it over to what are some of the risks that using OSS that users of open source software should be considering and monitoring for?
One thing, and we talked about this, and I know you have a lot of background in this too, is typically for companies, they need other third parties are interested in what's going on. And you refer to that as diligence, right? And standard diligence questions typically focus on a range of IP issues. And one of them is, what third-party IP are you using? And in particular, often those diligence questions call out, are you using open source software in your technology development or even just for the functionality of your business? And so you need to respond accurately to that. And if you are saying yes, you need to be able to de-risk that or give comfort to those interested. And so that is, to me, a risk, because if you're using it without thinking about it thoughtfully, you might not be able to respond in a way that addresses the concerns of those third parties. So it actually, a risk may be that you're not getting the investment, the acquisition's on hold, or it may block a deal, or it may lengthen the time for a deal. It may also reduce your evaluation if it's core to the technology product, or if it's so commingled with the code that you can't separate your own technology from that third party
Yeah,
code
no,
base. So
for sure.
that's a diligence issue. And that, as I mentioned, it could block a deal or lengthen a deal. Also, you might have customer or licensees or customer agreements or license agreements or just general collaboration agreements where you're bringing something to the table or providing something to third parties. And typically those include reps and warranties saying, sometimes they even call out open source, saying the software does not include open source software. So you have to honor that. So if you are using open source software, you'd actually be breaching that representation or warranty. Or even if it doesn't call that out particular, it might also include a liability section where you're on the hook for any downstream liability relating to IP infringement claims. And so your customer may be using something and there might result in an IP infringement claim, and they might go back to you. And if you're using open source software and there might be an infringement issue relating to that, you might be on the hook for that downstream liability. So just making sure to understand that could potentially be an IP infringement risk.
Mhm.
There also is more practical tools. Typically, when you would buy commercial software, you're getting some form of a warranty or some assurance that, look, this is my work. I have the ability to grant this permission to you. Whereas in the open source software space, typically the software is provided as is. So use at your own risk, no warranty, disclaiming any liability as well. And so there's no assurance that the code does not infringe third-party rights. There's not typically that rep and warranty saying, this is my code. I have the ability to give you this license or this permission. You don't really know, how that code was developed. There's no clearance typically done. And so you have no way to vet or a promise that, the permission of the code, the owner of the copyright in the code is actually released it under this license. And so if the owner did not authorize that, even if you're using it in compliance with the license, you still may not be challenged. That use may still be challenged by the owner. And there also is some practical security risks as well, because the open nature of the code, bad actors may come in, study the code, identify holes or what have you, and be able to then, if they know your product incorporates that, be able to access that as well. So there are security risks, but I agree with your earlier point, Byron, that it's also sometimes really well vetted, so it actually might be more secure. So I think you see that a lot. You really have to do your own diligence on those practical risks.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a give and take on the security side. In one hand, there's sometimes thousands of people reviewing the code and identifying gaps. But when malware does infiltrate something, because it is often so popular, there could be millions or tens of millions of people or companies affected by um, those capabilities. And so bad actors often target people who are using open source libraries if they are able to find cracks in their defense. And so then it's also incumbent, I guess, on software developers, product managers, and teams to upgrade packages when they become available, and there are kind of additions or updates to those libraries. Maybe flipping over, I know when we talk about open source, then there's lots of different types of contracts available. They fall within a kind of a number or kind of two main groups. Maybe let's just talk a little bit about the different flavors of open source and why software companies need to be thinking about which ones they're leveraging at any given time.
Yeah, absolutely. So you generally see two buckets. You see sort of permissive licenses, and we talk about open source in relation to the licenses that are applied to that code. So you have permissive licenses as well as copyleft licenses, and it's a play on the word copyright, of course. And so in permissive licenses, the requirements or the conditions to use are generally pretty light or permissive. So they may even permit commercial use. Generally, you need to provide notice that that the copyright owner is saying this code is by this entity or released, and then you need to provide a link or sometimes the entire license itself within the code, and that's generally all you have to do to meet some of the very permissive light licenses, like an MIT license as an example, or BSD, UC, or Berkeley software. And also Apache is a little bit, a few more conditions, but again, still permits commercial use. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the code that you create using the open source code has the same license applies. That is in contrast to the copyleft style licenses. And in that case, what the goal generally of those licenses is that so any code or derivative work or modification, and again, these are general terms and there's not a one size fits all, but generally, if you do new stuff with the code or commingle it with your own code in a certain way, then the overall package is subject to the same license terms, including the requirement to make the source code available. So that is typically in contrast to a proprietary license that says no source code, you only get object code or the machine readable aspect, and no reverse engineering, no modification. So you see that. So those typically don't work together. So a company should care, because if they're hoping to release sort of an end product through their own proprietary license, but yet they incorporate code from a copyleft style, then those requirements will continue on through to the overall product. And some licenses actually prohibit commercial use or require additional requirements if there is commercial use as well. So again, if a company is planning to release a commercial product, they need to be on side that. So again, these are high level comments. There's not one copyleft license. There is an illegal definition of what copyleft means as well. And so that's one of the issues. And there's also a whole bunch of really interesting ad hoc licenses, because again, you're free to do whatever you want and draft whatever type of license you want. So one we talked about was the JSON license. And one of the conditions is that the software shall be used for good and not evil. So again, it just gives you a sense of how you can make whatever condition or requirement you want. It's tricky to figure out what is good and not evil as well, though, because these aren't generally defined terms and subjective. So again, it does make a challenge from a compliance perspective. And why should you care about complying with a license? Because if you don't comply, then you actually don't have the permission to use the code, and then you'll have a copyright or an IP infringement risk more generally. So you should definitely try to comply. But as we talked about, it can get pretty complicated if you're using, hundreds of different open source tools, which may have 100 different licenses associated with it, and tracking all of those different conditions and terms can be very tricky. So generally, it's a bit of a complex issue. And so the infringement risk is real, because compliance and non-compliance can be complicated and hard for companies to manage.
Okay, wow. So a question for you on this point is, have you ever had to write a legal opinion on what's evil?
I actually have. A risk assessment. It wasn't a full-on opinion, but it was assessing certain use cases and saying, on the balance, I'm not sure about this one. So yeah, definitely.
It seems like a
Go to the
fun kind of
dictionaries.
hypothetical, but right, if you have to stay
Hmm.
inside a license, like you have to make these kind of value-based decisions in some cases where, right, the license requires it.
Hmm.
Can we
Yeah,
maybe just
exactly.
on this is a lot of and I know open source was created when we were actually installing software a lot more. How have things changed as more and more things have gone to the cloud or service-based? Kind of do the same rules apply, or are there ways that or have licenses kind of adapted to kind of that change in deployment?
Well, if you're going to the cloud, the license might look a little bit different because it might just be an access license. But again, you're free to specify what you can and cannot do with the code. So even accessing it and using functionality, even if you're not downloading it onto your own system and changing it, could still require an open source license to certain degrees. So yeah, just because it's in the cloud doesn't necessarily mean, again, there's no terms applicable, just making sure to track them. You just might be able to, the risk might be a little bit more limited because you might not have the code and distribute it. You have the ability to distribute it if the code is actually indeed on third-party servers and you can't access it that way. But typically, for open source, you generally can download it and open up the package and change it and access it. So if it's in the cloud, they would need an interface to permit that ability. I think if we're still talking about open source in the sense that you can access the source code, because you might not even know or be able to access it. So I think just making sure that, again, if we go back to the very, very general definition, if it's just a free service that you access through the cloud, it could still be within this open source definition, but you'll have to just monitor the terms of use or the access conditions as well.
Interesting. Like you mentioned some of the potential consequences. Has there been much case law on this? Any litigation examples you can refer to?
Yes, yeah, there are litigation examples predominantly in the US, but we also see allegations, of course, in Canada. One example to highlight related to model train industry, there is some software in that space. And so a good takeaway for the group is that in that case, only a small portion of the code was used. I think it was less than 1% of the overall open source code base, but they used it in a way that didn't comply with the licenses. So that use was found to still be a copyright infringement, even just that small portion. So again, just because if you could download an open source package, review through the code and just pull one or a couple clauses out, that alone could still be an infringement. You don't have to use the entire package together. It's a substantial portion in Canada effectively, and that portion can be a qualitative portion, not just a quantitative portion. So that's something
Okay.
to keep in mind. So just cutting and pasting, we still have to comply with the license terms. It's not necessarily the whole package. Another area related to using sort of hardware boxes. And an interesting thing to highlight is you might think, well, these seem like very organic, grassroots, code-based licenses. Everybody's free to use. Let's all work together. But this is actually the Software Freedom Center, or there's various organizations involved. These organizations are very organized. They have lawyers on their team. They're well funded. They care about the use of the community and protecting the community. So they don't want commercial actors coming in and using the code as they want and not complying with the license, keeping their downstream code closed when they've actually taken really good stuff from those licenses. So that's something to consider. Just because it's for free, you think, oh, they'll never find me, or they're not organized. No, actually they are, and they really do want to protect the values of the open source community. And so they're watching and they're navigating that. So keep that in mind, and they're very organized and well funded.
Yeah.
Another area, that we talked about that we're seeing a lot more is in the artificial intelligence space. You could have certain types of models. We're hearing a lot about LLMs, for example, or large language models. And similarly, you see data sets as well. So data sets are a little different because typically they're not open source in the sense that they don't have source code. Maybe they have some metadata, but they don't have traditional source code. But the data effectively, these large data sets are released for free with standard licenses that you don't really negotiate. So I guess we can consider those open source as well. And similarly, the LLM. So we talked about yesterday, Byron, or yeah, I think it was yesterday, Llama, for example, is released on open source, under open source, but it's been trained already as well. So we actually don't know exactly how that was trained, and you might be able to access aspects of the model, of course, but you don't necessarily understand the whole training process. It's not like that's all transparent or released as well. So it could be trained on assets on the internet without permission of the copyright owner. And so that training alone may be an infringement of copyright, depending on the factors. It's very fact dependent, the assessment on infringement, but you just don't have that ability. So there's, of course, risk associated with using those LLMs, but also the data sets as well. We've seen some data sets were created by just grabbing a bunch of images from the internet, for example, without getting permission of the owner. And then one third party is releasing that aggregate set under an open source or a free license. And even if you're complying with the license, there might be images by third parties that do not want you to use them. And so all of a sudden you see them coming out of the woodworks, and you might see watermarks, for example, in those images. So there is a way to trace those aspects of those data sets as well.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that's like just a fascinating question right now. And so because this is still being litigated and is still up for grabs in terms of training sets and the internet as a whole, whether or not copyright exists in it's an infringement of copyright in order to be just scraping the internet. Like I know the New York Times and a number of different media and news personalities have sued OpenAI and I think Meta over these issues. And so TBD on terms of, right, is their use of training on the internet an infringement of copyright? And how does that pass through the open source license if you're using Llama, for example? I think OpenAI, you may have some indemnities, but you may not even have it there, right, when you're using their software.
I think you highlight a really complicated aspect to it, because there could be, copyright issues at play. Is training an infringement of copyright? And even if it is an infringement, there could be a defense of fair dealing in Canada or fair use in the United States. And then, of course, also you're highlighting there's a contractual layer as well. So you might not even be complying with other terms of that contract in addition to the copyright aspect. So it could say, you can only use it if you do this. Well, you're not complying with that term as well, or you must do this and you're not doing that. You could have a contract issue as well. Or if you're accessing the work from third-party websites, there could be terms of use on those websites that you might be breaching. So a lot of different property or IP right issues, as well as the contractual issues to consider for these.
Yeah. Are the licenses themselves evolving in order to address some of these issues? Have you seen new versions of any of them, right? Whether permissive or copyleft, that are trying to address, right? I know some of them, a lot of them at one time addressed cloud, but are they trying to address training and AI?
But yes, yeah, you're seeing some saying, especially carving out and saying no training from any of these images because they're evolving, and you can do that, or they're permitting particular uses as well. You also see an evolution from some of the earlier licenses only called out copyright license, for example, or just said a license to use, and they left the patent license, for example. And so you could have permission from a copyright owner to do something with the code, but you may be offside a patent that overlaps the functionality. So you see sort of later versions of those open source licenses coming in and providing that or a version of a patent license. But an interesting part is that you have patents that cover the functionality and you're asserting those actively against third parties, you may lose the license provided by that open source. They're trying to create, again, that freedom, the freedom to use, even at the functionality level. And so you're seeing that evolution too. And you're seeing new data licenses spin out that are not piggybacking off of the existing more software oriented open source licenses that we're talking about. So you're seeing that as well. And as you mentioned, cloud as well and access, and there's these different terminologies used, and they're also looking at what it means to distribute or make available. So just getting more nuanced in terms of the way that software is being accessed and used.
Okay. Yeah, no, interesting. And obviously it's an evolving sphere of law, right? Or just use in general. It's hard to believe it's
Mhm,
only been 2.5 years since the first version of ChatGPT became widely available, and how
mhm.
prevalent now LLMs and other forms of AI have just embedded themselves within everyone's everyday workflow, but also the development of software and deployment of software. And so kind of along that veins, and knowing that the landscape continues to evolve and change, and who knows what the next flavor will be, how should startups really think about this? And are there any best practices we should be kind of enforcing now in order to stay on side with current OSS or open source understanding, right? And then maybe prepare for what may be to come. And maybe just as a quick reminder, I know we have about 60 people on this call. Most of the companies that are accessing Accelerate IP are on the smaller side. Lots are just in the company formation stage or getting first product, kind of seed stage level companies. And so may not have had right the time or the funds to really think about usage policies. And so when you're dealing with early stage companies, what is the advice that you're often giving them on how to stay on side their open source usage?
I think just it goes back to IP more generally. I think culture and awareness and education is sort of at the root. And I think early stage companies might have an advantage in that if they might be a smaller team, it might be easier to create that education and awareness within the team from an early stage so that good habits are developed really early on, as opposed to sort of a company with a much larger team, a much larger code base, not tracking all of that stuff, and now realizing the issues and kind of going back and redoing potentially. So I think there could be an advantage to being a smaller company and early start and clean development and a smaller team for that ongoing education and development. And generally, you want to assess the license terms before using it or incorporating the code. And I think a key thing about the education piece is just because it's free from a royalty perspective or a cost perspective doesn't mean it doesn't have conditions and requirements that you have to adhere to too. So just getting that in line, because that's a very common misconception, even around larger companies and very sophisticated technology companies, there still can be some of those misconceptions around some of the team members. And so getting that early, making sure that and it could be any assets, like we mentioned, data itself or images can be released under these free licenses, but just pausing and considering those license like you would any other procurement or commercial inbound license, just assessing those terms and tracking them and really keeping an inventory. So tracking the components, the names, the licenses, how they're used. Try to avoid commingling, or at least you can de-risk if, say, you make a modification and a whole series of conditions apply to a modification. We'll try using it as a standalone feature instead without any changes. And so, as I mentioned, there's a lot of sophisticated open source tools that have been tried and tested. So maybe you don't even want to change it just from a usability standpoint. So keeping that tracking and that inventory is really key. Even from a small company, setting up a compliance program and a team and incorporating that as part of a procurement process, even if it's just one person, at least somebody is sort of managing and owning it and being responsible and that again, it applies to using anybody else's IP. It doesn't mean it's not specific to open source. It's any third party IP. And so that's including scraping images off the internet or any other way you're getting information in to the company. You want that clean development or the ability to say, this is mine. This is what I created. And if you're using somebody else's, you gotta understand that deal. And that again, it goes back to the culture piece. This is the way you do things. So as your company's growing, your base group of employees have that culture and that awareness. And so then again, as new people come on, that just hopefully keeps continuing and having that onboarding. And even as part of the onboarding of a new employee, making sure everybody understands those clauses in their employment agreement, and they all should have one saying, don't taint our IP with third-party IP. And you have an obligation to raise your hand and let us know before doing that. And so building that compliance program, I know there's a million, everybody's wearing a lot of different hats at those early stages, but it's really important because, as I mentioned earlier, those diligence questions are coming on investment or acquisition or just generally from your board. So you need to get ready to speak intelligently about IP and show that have that culture and that management.
Yeah, for sure. And so you mentioned some of the kind of checklists that companies should be doing in order to kind of track and manage, right? So keep inventories. I guess one thing we kind of mentioned before is like monitor for security updates. I think that's really important as well, as especially as you're leveraging all of these packages, they're all being updated on a continuous basis. And so ensuring that you're using the ones that are most secure, because as mentioned before, if there are holes in very widely used ones, bad actors often will try to target companies that are slow to patch. And so, right, there's that good and the bad of hopefully you're picking packages that are quite secure. But when something does go wrong, and something always goes wrong, you need to be on top of patching to ensure that you're not leaving your organization open to vulnerabilities.
And it's a little bit, sometimes it can be information overload, but also we have so many tools at our fingertips now to do a little bit of checking, like security, issue, breach, and then the name of the tool. And you usually find those information. And again, with the open source community behind certain tools, they make issues aware. They often patch them as well, or they've also typically tested them pretty thoroughly as well. So you hopefully don't have them, but there's information out there. Similarly, look for lawsuits or do some digging like you would any other initial diligence. And this doesn't have to be day-long exercises. Just spend a half an hour before taking on that risk and then putting a note to it. So at least if it ever comes back again, you can say, oh, I did check. So the other thing to consider too is that there are a lot of I'm not sure most people know this online, but if not, there are a lot of automated tools that can detect open source because again, the nature of it is that the software code is available and it's open. And so that enables a lot of these automated tools to be developed because all they have to do is go cut through code and look to find matches of this open source code because they know the universe of open source code or they found it. And so even if you're pretty comfortable with the cultures there, that your developers, your product team won't incorporate third-party code, running those proactive audits is important. Black Duck is an example that comes to mind, but there are other tools. And so what may be discovered because again, it's very common that a potential acquirer or sophisticated investors are going to run those tools or ask for those reports anyways. And then they'll pass those reports on to their law team and they'll go through them. And so that's something that I've done before, for example, is look through those audit reports. So if you do that early and regularly, there'll be hopefully no surprises when you get to those really key junctures that you just want a smooth sailing, easy answer for those questions and avoid those lags or potential blocks.
Yeah, and it feeds into a training and awareness program, and right, hopefully your companies have policies regarding which open source licenses even to use or ones that are permitted within the organization, but then it'll help enforce. And maybe speaking of which, like deciding between licenses, you kind of mentioned that there's complications sometimes on working with different licenses together. In some cases, they're incompatible. And so you may not want to add the two together. How should startups, right, land on a license that that works for them? Are there any tips or tricks that you can recommend?
And when you mean works for them, do you mean for using third-party code or for distributing their own code?
For using in generally, like I would say, do you encourage your clients to just pick one and stick with one and find tools that are all within the one so that you know that they're kind of copacetic? Are there bundles of ones that kind of work well together and you say, okay, we'll pick from any of these three licenses when you're going out and looking for packages? And are there ones that you
Yeah.
don't want to mix, kind of
Yeah.
thing?
And that's exactly it, Byron. You kind of group by families, or it's also the code itself that you want. You don't want to just focus on the license only. It's like due diligence and awareness on the code, but also the license. And
For
so,
sure.
the compatibility issue, I think what you're getting at is that you need to comply with all of the license terms. So if I'm using 3 different tools and they're subject to 3 different licenses, I need to make sure I meet all of those different terms simultaneously if I'm using all of those 3 together. And sometimes there may be conflicting ones. For example, a copyleft license may say, if you change this code or incorporate it with something else, with another piece of code, then both that code, that combined code must also have its source code available. But you might be using third-party commercial code that says this is confidential. You cannot reverse engineer, you cannot access the source code at all, let alone make it available. So that's an example of incompatible licenses. So if you're using commercial software or your own in-house developed software that you plan to release under commercial license, and you want to keep that confidential because it's a trade secret of the company, for example, those would be incompatible. Generally, permissive licenses, particularly like MIT, as I mentioned, it typically just give notice of the copyright and the license terms. That typically can be used with most licenses because those are pretty easy terms to comply with, and they're also typically found in most other licenses already. So we would typically give a set of sort of low risk from a compliance standpoint license terms. But again, you don't want to just focus on the licenses alone. You really want to make sure the risk around the software code itself is assessed. Another license that I find is interesting is the Apache license. There's a bit more control, but it still permits commercial use. And so that's one that you see a lot of companies using. So if it is a commercial entity, you typically want to stay with some of those more permissive licenses and avoid the GPL style licenses or what have you, or some of the older outdated licenses are typically hard to get compatibility. But fortunately, again, the open source software community is just lovely in the sense that they give a lot to the community, and you can find some amazing charts out there as well. So this is complicated, but you will see compatibility charts and you can do a little digging, and there's usually some really good input. So you're not feeling alone. So if you are an early stage company, this all feels overwhelming, type compatibility and the 2 licenses that you're looking at, and you'll find a lot of resource around that. And that's really what the compatibility is getting at. You don't want inconsistent or conflicting terms because often it's multiple licenses at play.
Yeah, that's great advice. How about like if we think about the companies, should board, should founder, CEO, should development managers think about things differently, or do they have should they be asking the same questions? Like any differences between that?
Not necessarily. Particularly if you have a smaller, early stage company, people are often wearing multiple roles, but you shouldn't just focus on the development team, for example, because the procurement team needs to be aware of this, or the product team, when they're going around to look for aspects or functionality of the product, they might not have to generate something from scratch. So being aware of, low risk tools that are out there that work. So everybody should be educated together. You might want to have a different flavor of the details. For example, the development team might be much more comfortable getting into the details of some of the aspects of the licenses because they're quite technical. To your earlier discussion around cloud access versus downloading, the traditional downloaded software. There's a lot of complexity around architecture and usage within the licenses themselves. So the development team might be a little bit more comfortable with that, but having the development team be part of the education process for the product team or even the board or all these non-technical folk may be a really great way to empower and educate because, as we know, you've got to help and explain it to somebody else. Often you're learning it a lot more yourself. So I typically say get everybody involved, even if there's might be more technical folk in the room, because they jump on in and they shine when you're looking at some of these really complex distribution or contribution language.
Yeah, perfect. I have a couple more questions, but before I get to that, I just want to invite questions from the audience. If you have any questions for Maya on open source software or anything that we've talked about during this session, please start filling the chat with them. We should have some time to be able to get to at least a couple of them. Okay, so Maya, one thing that I want to just quickly bring up that I found really interesting when we were doing our prep call was talking about, and this is maybe not necessarily purely tied to open source, uh, but it's talking about copyright, and open source and copyright are very much tied together, but talking about copyright of code generated by LLMs. I know Copilot and OpenAI and so many other tools are now generating code, helping developers become much more effective and efficient. But from a copyright perspective, how does that play in today's world? And I'm not sure if there is an open source angle to it, but I thought it was really interesting when we started talking about it yesterday.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned before, I'm assuming that copyright is protecting the code because generally if code is an original work, at least in Canada, and there's human skill and judgment involved, copyright protects that code as a literary work. And so with that protection, you then are free to permit or not permit and provide the license requirements. But if copyright doesn't attach to that code or protect that code, then that code is free to be used without worrying about a license. And so when you're looking at code generated by an AI machine autonomously, it's actually a pretty live issue whether or not copyright applies at all to that code. The issue is how much human involvement is there if the machine's truly creating on its own. And it also matters what country you're looking at. And so in the United States, we've already seen some opinions from the Copyright Appeal Board, for example, saying that if it's a purely AI generated work, and they said this in the context of a painting or an image, but it applies equally to code. If it's purely AI generated, then copyright does not apply. You need a human involved as an author of that work. And so if code is generated automatically, say in the United States, without a human, and there's no human author, it's only a machine author, and that resulting code actually doesn't have copyright protection. So you could use that. But third parties could also use it, and you wouldn't have the ability to stop that necessarily, at least under copyright. There might be a contractual issue that you can address, or you might call it something else like confidential information or a trade secret, for example. But copyright alone is not going to help you if that was purely automated. And so if you're hoping as a company developing code, you're hoping that copyright attaches to that code, you're going to want to make sure in your usage policies more generally, and this may not be like an open source usage policy, it might be just an IP policy more generally or an AI policy. You're going to want to make sure that you're going to prevent autonomous generation of code by a machine and making sure you have a human in the loop. And so a human can be involved in the prompt side, or it could be a selection thing where you're getting bits and pieces here, but you're not getting the full package, or you're getting like 4 alternatives and a human is evaluating those alternatives and picking the best one based on its own skill and judgment, and then documenting all of this very clearly so that if that is challenged later. For example, if you assert that somebody's used that code or misused it and there's a copyright infringement, one of their defenses may be that there actually is no copyright in that code. And this may come up more and more commonly if everybody knows that everybody now, as a standard, is using AI for code development. And this is maybe too early, but maybe in 10 years, this may be the standard, right? We don't really have those issues with some of the code tools, at least when I was at U of T and like from 99 to 2003. Like, I mean, we didn't have AI tools helping us at all. It was pretty basic, but that could be more and more common as well. So those are things to consider when you're developing new assets with AI tools, to make sure you have a human in the loop so that you have that ability. But you might not even care. You might just want the development of the code more generally. And so you could just freely use it and say, here it is, free to use. And that's more like a public domain style of case where there's just no copyright at all. So anybody can use it for free. So I think it's a little different than open source. And sometimes there's a confusion between that, where public domain is where there's no copyright anymore. There's no copyright protection, whereas open source there is copyright protection. It's just you can use it for free, subject to these terms.
Yeah. And I think this is a live question, especially, and I don't know if any of our audience is using LLMs to generate things that are selling. But like I can imagine, for example, and I've done this, is like I built presentations using LLMs, and you can also build websites, right? So front-facing websites, almost completely by AI, right? And if there's no copyright on that, like then you have no ability to stop others from basically copying your website and impersonating you.
Hmm.
Um, and
Or
so,
images, like you
or
could use
images, yeah,
one of these image tools, and then so you might not be able to prevent third parties if you have a really great image or a logo on your website that you used a tool to generate autonomously. And so that's one issue. So you can't prevent misuse by third parties. But the other issue is sort of back to my earlier point is they're typically provided as is, and they don't stand behind the output. And so that output actually may actually embody somebody else's IP.
for
And you're
sure.
putting on your website, you're like, well, I got it from this system and I assumed I was free to use it because it was output and there's no copyright protection. It's like, well, no, that's actually still embodied. It trained the system using my copyright, and there's some residual um, elements of the work in there. So that's also an issue to consider. Back to that, use
Yeah,
as is at your own risk. We don't say that this is ours, and so these are live issues if you're creating assets and building your company around that.
yeah. It's very fascinating because so many people are doing those types of things for kind of low value things that they're just trying to get
Hmm.
done at any given time. And
Yeah,
so,
and I
I
see
mean,
one of the questions is asking about a due diligence checklist. And so I'm happy to grab sort of a standard one. There's different flavors, of course, depending on the perspective or how rigorous, but happy to give that one to Byron, or I see Angie's online too. We can send that so that the team has that, because I always recommend that to companies in an early stage when they're doing an IP audit, is to look at that diligence question list, because you know where you're going, right? And if you're comfortable with answering all those questions, or at least know these are issues, if I do something that's within these questions, I need to accurately respond. So happy to find one of those checklists for the team to have.
for sure. And we'll share your information at the end of this as well. And if
Hmm.
they're open to it, they can just reach out to you directly. Uh,
Hmm. And
um,
it says, do you recommend using open source to help with an IP application, and how would it be used? Well, it again, it really depends on the nature of the open source tool, like the software functionality. But say, for example, there was a really good open source search engine out there, right? Or a tool that you could download and parse through a bunch of patent documents for certain keyword terms. It could be used then to figure out if what you're filing a patent for is indeed new and not obvious. And so, again, I don't know if that's unique to open source, but there just might be a tool like that available under an open source license as
mhm.
well. I don't know,
Yeah,
do you have any
maybe
other thoughts about using it for an IP application?
I haven't given, well,
Spell
it'd be
check? Maybe there's a spell checker or
yeah,
something. I don't
well, for
know.
sure
Like,
you're doing that, but it'd be interesting
yeah.
to see, right? If you upload, you draw your own figures and you upload that to up to an AI and ask them to draft your specification. Like I can imagine there's some company that's trying to help patent lawyers draft patent applications.
Hmm.
That may be helpful in that case. Um,
That would make me nervous, I must say, because of course we know it must be new and not obvious over what's known before, and I would just wouldn't know the contents. That I wouldn't know the origin of the content. So I typically like to start with a blank piece of paper. I have,
yeah.
and use what the client originally provides. But I agree, we're seeing so much. I also know, like, this isn't specific to IP applications, but many years ago, I think it was Google that created an LLM, and they trained it only on the patents documents, all patent publications.
Mm,
I always thought that was fascinating to see that, how is that was used, how that train model was used. Patents have a certain format to them, so you could say, there's a set formula generally for patents and claims and stuff. So I just thought that was really interesting, and I always had that personally on something on my list to say, oh, that would be, because we're learning, generally garbage in, garbage out. We all know that from
mm,
computer science, and so if you do use really focused sets of training materials, you get really interesting trained LLMs out of that. So I don't, like I said, I don't know what they do that use that for. I also know patent examiners use a lot of tools as well, looking for
Mhm.
similarities and that sort of thing. Again, I don't know if it's specific to open source. They're probably using proprietary tools, but maybe they're using some open source tools as well.
And we're seeing this across all organizations. Like I think there's a lawyer in BC who's been reprimanded because they tried to draft their pleadings using OpenAI and forgot to remove certain things. And it was like very clearly, hey, I'm an AI, I'm not able to comment on this. And so definitely it's a brave new world out there. And so we'll see how different organizations treat generated content. Um,
Mhm.
Maybe I think we're wrapping up on our questions, and I do see a lot of questions coming in the chat. Maybe last questions to you before we go back to the chat are um, any considerations for companies who are thinking of releasing software under their own license? How should they choose which ones that they want to attach to?
Mhm. Absolutely. So I think you want to identify the objectives. And you want to if you want to maximize adoption, then you probably would want a more light touch, like one of those more permissive licenses, because more companies and not-for-profits or different entities will use it because it's just easier to comply and less risky. But if you want to ensure that all of the contributions and downstream usage also remain open, then you probably want to go and look at one of those more detailed copyleft style licenses or something in the middle. If you want to protect against commercial exploitation, you could actually pick an open source license and then you can actually add like a rider on top of it
Mm.
and say it's this license plus all of these terms as well. So you can actually call out commercial usage, but there's also a lot of open source licenses that particularly prohibit commercial use or say only for non-commercial purposes. So just look for those kinds of licenses. And I do want to kind of step back again. And like I said, from a general takeaway is open source licenses are just posted on the internet and you don't negotiate them. And they're kind of standard licenses, let's just say. So one thing I have seen a tremendous benefit of using open source licenses is speed to agreement. You can sometimes eliminate negotiating and a really bespoke custom license, which can be long and maybe the parties don't agree. So I've seen very efficient collaborations where all parties involved decide on a common license, like Apache say, 2.0, they release all of the assets of a project through the same license, and then they all promise to release the project results through that license too. And so, very interesting way to kind of eliminate negotiations. Like, this is the terms, all the assets in, we all can use it subject to these terms. Of course, it doesn't necessarily enable proprietary terms in there, but it can because you can pick a nice license and you can layer other things on top. But I just wanted to highlight that really what it is a standard license posted on the internet that's like, we're not negotiating
Mhm.
this anymore. So that philosophy more generally, I think, can apply to much more than just software.
Yeah, and maybe we should take a step back and say why you would want to release something on with an open source license. And I think to your comment is like, hey, when you're collaborating and you want to figure out, okay, well, we're all going to do some work together, and we don't know how. Like to your comment, who owns what? You can just like everyone owns everything,
Hmm.
and you can't block anyone from doing anything. But maybe just can talk a little bit about some of your clients or some of the situations where commercial companies who are building stuff and making revenue, right? Not
Hmm.
necessarily a part of a community per se, but why they should sometimes think about using an open source license or want to use an open source license.
Because it does enable widespread adoption as well. More and more companies will use it or entities will use it, and then you might get free testing and vetting and ultimately end up with a better quality product. And then the buy-in from a community of users as well. And then you see that all the time. I ask companies, why are you using this tool? It's like, well, everybody uses it. It's the industry standard. Our competitors all use this tool. This is the way we go. And it's like, okay, well, then widespread adoption can be very, very, very persuasive. And especially if you're testing or if you're in a clinic or in a research environment and you just want as many users or as many downloads as possible, those metrics matter depending on your interest holders. And so adoption is ultimately a big area that we see people looking at open source when they otherwise wouldn't.
Yeah. I know some companies that I've worked with release their source code in open source, and maybe they're a hardware company and like they think the value is in the hardware, and so they sell the hardware, and then like a community helps build stuff on the software side from a application and capability perspective. And I've seen other ones work where um, like they're selling services, and so they'll release the source code. Community will build around that, and then if you want to actually implement it for commercial use, you'll hire them to leverage the open source software and build a custom application for you.
Or you can also see the same piece of code released in a hybrid format. So it might say, if you want to use the code for free, you have to comply with this license, like, GPL or what have you. But hey, if you want to pay, we'll give you a much nicer license, but you're paying for it. So you also see those hybrid models as well.
Fascinating. Okay, we're coming up on time, but I do want to get to at least a couple more questions. So if everyone can bear with us, we'll try and get a couple, or we'll address a couple. So what I'm seeing right now, I guess Emma asked a very salient question is, seems complicated. Should we just avoid this altogether? Hopefully we've kind of explained at least a few different situations where it does make sense to use open source licenses. And right, it's the right tool for the right place in certain circumstances, but obviously it's not for everyone.
And free matters, free and good quality together, bundled together, is persuasive.
Yeah, Jeff talks about the limitations and restrictions. Do you need to engage with a lawyer to discover which one is right for you?
If it's a very important aspect of your project and you really want to make sure you're getting it right, then I would suggest engaging with a lawyer. But if you're just using sort of a standalone tool for the purpose it's released for with a pretty nice light touch license like MIT, then I would suggest you probably don't. But I'm a lawyer, so I always say, talk to a lawyer. But in my opinion, if you're not changing anything and it's a very tried and tested tool, then you're probably is less risky to use it. If an MIT license, you'll see, is very short, so you're not interpreting what good and evil is and all of that fun stuff.
Yeah, I just highlighting Susan's comment talking about AI to draft patent applications, and how she wouldn't do that for fear of sharing her work with the AI, which could be used to train. Yeah, for sure, right? I guess there's opportunities to do RAGs to make sure that it's kind of stays within the four walls of your organization.
Yeah,
But
precisely. I think that raises a really great point, though,
yeah.
is just because a tool is free and you think it's all okay, you really don't have control once you put information in there. And so keeping, but it depends on your instance. Like we, as a firm, use certain AI tools, but we have a very rigorous process for it. And we for legal issues more generally, not specific to patents. And so we have our own servers, and the instance of that tool is on our own server. So that anything we provide into it is not going out of the Norton Rose environment, even to the provider of the AI
Yeah,
tool.
for sure. And coming back to paying OpenAI to set up a RAG on your own system and train their model on your data, but not leaving your private cloud, is definitely a business model that lots of folks are doing, right? That's what Llama is doing as well. Okay, I think I don't see any questions that we haven't really addressed. So maybe I'm going to just hand it over first. Thank you, Maya, for joining us this afternoon, talking about open source software. Right, as when we kind of think about the topic, and lots of people wouldn't think it's as interesting as it is, but I know with you as the speaker, it was a very engaging conversation. So I really appreciate you being with us here today. Any last words that you'd like to share, and maybe just also highlight how people can get in contact with you, and if you're open to that, assuming you are. But any last words that you'd like to share with our audience?
I think just because it's complicated or just because there are some risks associated with it, I think, watching this community and the nature of open source over the last few decades has been quite incredible. And so I think, It's definitely used by commercial entities now. I think generally, you know, a couple decades or 10 years ago, people would be like, no open source within this commercial operation. And now you're seeing a lot of companies using it. A lot of very powerful AI tools are released under open source licenses, for example. And so just trying to pause and educate yourself a bit, not just say no because it's confusing, because there are a lot of benefits. And also consider, like, you know, as we discussed, consider releasing aspects of your product under different open source licenses. Do that, of course, thoughtfully, and making sure you're complying with all of your internal IP policies and everybody signed off. But you know, adoption and getting a community of incredibly talented and people that can be very high cost, employing them individually on your side to help with that adoption and vetting is actually very powerful and very persuasive, as I mentioned. And there can be tremendous benefits, including just somehow quantifying that adoption in some way. So whether it's downloads or otherwise tracking and building that as part of your story in a positive, de-risked way, I think is something is worth the energy and the effort.
Mhm.
And you can get in touch with me by, you know, good old search engines by Maya Medeiros, or I think there might even be my name or my email on the link, but otherwise I can just reach out to Angie or anybody, or Byron, or anybody on the New Ventures team, and they usually know how to find me. Sorry, Angie, I don't mean to. I see you there. You're like center on my screen. So
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Maya. And once again, thank you to the New Ventures BC team.